Hello everyone, my name is Josh and welcome to WHIMS. And today I'm going to give you a slightly different video than usual. I'm going to be focusing on a video for my playlist called Tell Me a Story, which is where I did one video for that particular list called Story of Jay, Cerebral Palsy, which is basically about me talking about my disability. And then there was another video that I did where it was basically about me talking about my process as a writer, what I like to do, how I get inspired. But this particular video is for writing advice. So if you are a writer or you're aspiring to be a writer, this is a particularly interesting video for you guys to watch. So I'm just going to get right into it. My writing advice is always, one of my biggest points is always on reading. And when you want to be a writer, the classic argument is always, I want to be a writer, I want to write, but I don't have time to read. Well, my advice to that is always make time. And how you can make time usually is when you have little moments throughout your day. Let's say, for example, you're getting up in the morning and you're making breakfast to yourself. When you're having that moment, pick a book off the shelf, any book that you happen to find on your shelf, pick it up and give it a read. Like, you just give it a read and try to at least let that have at least a big portion of your day so you've read something. And then while you're preparing your lunch or you're preparing your breakfast, have something reading in front of you, whether it's a magazine or a newspaper or an app on your phone or whatever it is, or an article on your phone that you're reading. Always try to have something open on your phone or something that you can just read, so that you can squeeze in that reading time during your day. And then when you're at work, if you're at one of those jobs where it requires you to have both a lunch and a dinner break, always have a book ready on hand for when you're particularly out and about and you're actually reading something, or you're actually just reading a book in front of you. Or if you're a parent and you've just gotten the kids to bed and they're just nice and relaxed, or they're having an afternoon nap, take a book off your shelf and then just give it a read. Just give it a read, or get an app on your phone, get an article on your phone and just start reading. Keep reading as often as you can. Try to squeeze in little moments throughout your day where you're actually just reading something. Read anything, read a book preferably, but usually if you're reading an article on your phone or anything like that, please always try to squeeze in time throughout your day to read something. And then one of the things I will also say for writing advice is read within your genre, but also if you're a writer, especially if you're a writer, always try to read outside of your comfort zone whenever possible. Like, if you say, for example, if your speciality is, say if your favourite genre is a fantasy novel or a crime novel or a horror novel or a sci-fi novel, break away from horror, science fiction and crime and fantasy and dive into a romance novel, because romance is very good for understanding character and character development. You might want to go to fantasy if you're a romance novelist, or if you love your romances and you want to do other things, go to fantasy or science fiction or horror. Go to horror for the very inventive literary descriptions, because horror, if anything horror's taught us, it's usually that horror is the most literary genre in the history of the English language. Like, if you look back at the works of Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft, Shirley Jackson, Stephen King, E.F. Benson, all these great, horror writers and ghost story writers have a very heavily rich history of very literary novels, or even the works of Mary Shelley, like The Last Man, Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus. All these novels are very rich with descriptions, rich with heavy metaphors, and really beautiful writing. Like, if you really want to go for the really beautiful writing, go to horror, because that's where a lot of the inventive descriptions come in. But also I'd recommend you read poetry, because poetry is a very important thing to use if you want to really measure meter, the meter of a sentence, which is the rhythm in which the words go and how the words flow out of your mouth when you create that first sentence. That's always very crucial for when you're sort of creating your opening sentence, or when you're creating any sentences in your novel or in your short story. Poetry is always good for that, because it helps you understand rhyme and its rhythms, but it also helps you to establish tone and mood. And I think that's always very important. If you read a poem, you really do understand right away that there is always a use of mood. And always repetition is always considered a bit of bad writing, but poetry teaches you something which is very crucial, which is, if you have a line that's repeated, you usually do it for either emphasis or you're building towards something. My favourite example of how you use repetition effectively to build, to sort of, draw attention to something, is in the poem "The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock" by T.S. Eliot, where he uses the line, "We go through half-deserted streets, muttering retreats in cheap hotels, and dine on oyster shells, and the women come and go talking like Michelangelo." That's a very famous line that's repeated twice in the poem. It's repeated once at the very start when he's talking about him going with his lover out for the evening, going through the half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats and things like that, and the women coming and going talking about Michelangelo. He's talking about it as if he's a student studying art or architecture or, sculpting or whatever it is. And that's what you do when you're in your youth. But then, of course, he repeats it again halfway through the poem when he's at middle age. And it really does do to serve a contrast that he's very slowly starting to reminisce. And he's starting to really sort of get a sort of like a grapple on his mortality. And that's a very effective use of repetition. So when you're writing poetry effectively, you need to use repetition effectively and use it sparingly, where you only use it about once or twice. But that's usually used to draw emphasis to something, or you're building towards something. That's a very crucial bit of information. But use poetry to understand metaphors, to understand the structure of a sentence, how to measure the metre of a sentence, and how to also capture tone and mood. So use poetry for capture tone and mood. And also reading articles can help you understand different styles. I mean, with reading articles in newspapers or on your phone, you can understand the tone of it being very informative. It's meant to be giving information or giving insight. And there's all sorts of other things that you can do. And of course, with fantasy novels, it helps you to build world building. With romance, it helps you with character development and characterization. Various all sorts of different things. And one thing I will also say is always go out as often as you can. Like I went out yesterday, and there's all sorts of stories that are going on right around you. Like you literally look on the street, there's all sorts of stories happening. And when I was going through where I live, there was a guy on the phone who was literally talking to someone, and he literally said at one point in the conversation, "Look, just leave me alone." And I thought, well, why is he saying that? But he said it in a very aggressive tone. So I found myself thinking, oh, there's a story there. Like maybe he could have, maybe he's being harassed by someone. Maybe he's got, a very threatening caller, and they're threatening to, do something to him, or they're doing something to someone that they love. Maybe there's a story about him being an ex-policeman or an ex-military, and that he has some dirt on them, and they're threatening to go after his family or something like that, and they're maybe harassing him for that reason, and he doesn't know what to do. And he had a shopping bag with him, so maybe he has something in that shopping bag. So there's all these different things that kind of fueled my imagination when I was looking at that scene, when I was hearing that dialogue, that very brief dialogue. It was very fleeting, but that had all sorts of storytelling potential. Or he could have just been talking to some weird ghost creature, maybe the ghost of his past, maybe he was being taunted by his phone, maybe it's like a conduit for the dead. There's all sorts of crazy scenarios in which you can play with that. But that's basically what it is. A story is around you every single day. You just have to be well attuned to it and know when a good story is starting to develop. Always, I know it seems rude to say this, but whenever you catch a conversation happening in passing, that's usually the point when a story starts to develop. That's usually the beginnings of a story right there. And that's what I always like to do. I always like to go out, and I always like to, especially when I'm like going out and I'm having lunch, I'll always listen to conversations that other characters are having, like in passing. Sometimes I don't even intend to do it. I just catch little glimpses of it here and there. And that's usually what happens with creatives. Like we always, we're always living in the shadows, trying to capture little bits and pieces of things and turning them into stories. That's what you can do as well, but don't make it too obvious, because otherwise people think it's very strange. But that's another example. But also one of my favourite quotes with in regards to music: listen to your favourite song. Listen to the song that really moves you and really makes you. What I really think is very important about music is it should always make you drift away. It should always make you daydream and make you feel like, okay, this is there's something developing in my imagination here. And one of my favourite examples of when this happened to me was when I was listening to the Ed Sheeran song Castle on the Hill. And that song is a very interesting, it's very an uplifting, very triumphant song, but it also has a sadness to it. Like as the song goes on, it starts to become sadder, it becomes more bleaker, but then it also has this note of optimism. But this story started to unravel in my head when I started to listen to it, and it was actually a story of this disabled character who, whenever he is alone, he goes into his imagination. And when he goes into his imagination, he creates these worlds. And because he's at home at the first stages of his life, he's on his own at home alone and, playing his games. And he creates these entire worlds with these characters and these storylines. But then when he has his first day at school, he's very unfamiliar, he's very sad, he's very, missing his parents, and he starts to miss them. But then his friends come along, they invite him in, they take him in, they make him feel welcome. And he slowly starts to realise that he can actually use a special ability where he can touch things, touch Lego pieces, for example, and bring them to life, and they can build themselves up and talk to them and all the rest of it, and actually establish character and mood. But the more he becomes familiar with his school setting, the more he can change things, the more he can touch things and bring things to life and create this very imaginative, very creative world. But then as he gets older and he starts to become a teenager, he starts to go into the teen years, he starts to develop a very strong connection with his friends. Some of them he develops a very strong connection with some of them, and then others, they just sort of slide away from him. And then when he starts to feel most alone, he starts to retreat into his imagination because he can't keep up with them. So he decides to basically regress back into his imagination. And when he does this, and this is actually quite interesting between the teenage years and childhood, is that things tend to be a little bit more cynical, a little bit more bleaker, and a little bit more aggressive and almost emo-esque or very goth-esque. So I thought, well, the more childlike imagery and the more childlike elements of his imagination have now become twisted and warped in his mind as he's gotten older. So they start to take on a more horrifying approach. So it's almost like, well, instead of it's almost like a haunted house story, where instead of it being a location, it's sort of like a ghost story, but except there's a person who is haunted as opposed to an actual location like a manor house or a hotel room or anything like that. And that's what I thought was very interesting. And it all came from just that one song. And one of my favourite quotes to do with music, I can't remember who said it, but I think it was someone very important. They said, if you're not daydreaming when listening to music, you're not listening to good music. So if you have a song that really gets your imagination going, that you can just drift away to, and these stories and these ideas start to come into your head, really play with that, and really, play with the tone of the song, play with the melody, really kind of, work with it and see what sort of stories you can come up with. That's another example of how you can use just everyday things like music and things like that to really influence you and to really kind of play to those sorts of ideas. And another example, before I sign off with this particular video, is imagine you have a very bad film, but a film that you really enjoy watching despite its terrible writing. One of my favourite So Bad It's Good films is Tommy Wiseau's The Room. And this film is a terrible melodrama written and directed and produced by Tommy Wiseau. Now, Tommy Wiseau is this guy with very long hair. Excuse me. And he says he's American, but he talks with a bit of an accent. And he's very weird. He almost has kind of like this slur to his speech. Like whenever he talks, he always sounds like he's semi-drunk or on the verge of getting drunk. It feels very bizarre. Like it's a very bizarre accent that he has. And you can't quite place it either. And he's a very strange individual. And he made this film called The Room, which essentially is meant to be like a melodrama along the lines, I suppose he was thinking of something like, A Streetcar Named Desire, or any of those sorts of melodramas like Rebel Without a Cause of James Dean. But instead, he creates this very hilarious romp through just a whole bunch of tangents until we eventually come to a climax where it's supposed to be tragic and it's supposed to be sad, but it just comes across as funny or very kind of over the top and very, crazy and insane. But one of my favourite scenes in the entire film is when he comes in. It's the rooftop scene, effectively, where he comes in. He's having a go at his mother-in-law after his fiancée accuses him of hitting her. And it should be a very serious scene. It should be a very dramatic scene. But the way he performs it, it's very kind of it's almost like he doesn't care about what he's supposed to be conveying. And he doesn't understand what acting is. And the whole entire point of acting is you're supposed to put yourself in the mindset of this character. He feels angry, he feels aggressive. But he almost does it to the point of being over the top. And I took that scene on the rooftop and I took the actual structure. One of the things that really glued me to that scene was where this story came from that Mark, his friend, tells. It's actually revealed earlier on in the story that Mark is actually cheating on Tom. It is actually, having an affair with Tommy Wiseau's character, Johnny's wife, and it's the whole thing. But he basically he's had this affair, and he's up on this rooftop and he's chatting with Johnny, and he comes out with this story about this woman who dated a bunch of guys, and she had sex with a couple of them, and one of the guys found out and beat her up so badly that she ended up in a hospital in Guerrero Street. And that I thought was such a bizarre story because it doesn't really add anything to the overall scene that's being established. It doesn't establish any themes or anything like that. And I thought, well, you could do something with this. And I actually just took that scene and I took that story and I reworked it a little bit so that it was set in the UK as opposed to San Francisco. And I changed the names of the characters, and I basically just said, okay, let's tell this short story, but instead of it being in a rooftop or in San Francisco, let's have it be in a public house in London, and let's have these two characters just talk, and have Mark be this character who is planning on telling his friend that he's having an affair with his best friend's fiance. But instead of doing that, he explains it through the point of view of a fable. He explains it through a word that he heard on the street, and that he's pretty much doing it all off the cuff. So that pretty much tells you that he's a bit of a manipulator. So you can play with all these different things. You can take that character that is a very blank screen. Like, you honestly, there's nothing going on upstairs in terms of Mark's imagination in this story. But for me, I think what's very interesting is I took that scene and I basically turned Mark, or Matthew, into this much more manipulative character. And he's much more, he's much more like Tom Ripley in The Talented Mr. Ripley, in the sense that he's very manipulative, he's very kind of, almost, very stereotypically good looking, he's very well groomed and everything like that. And of course his friend, Johnny, turns out to be Owen, who was a character in the book that I've just mentioned called From the Sleeper's Notebook. He sort of squeezed his way into it. And I actually really like that. I actually really like the fact that this character that I had previously written and created for that novel had come into this story, and I decided to rewrite the story around him and him coming into the pub and, having this thing happen. It's such an interesting thing. So I think that's something that you can do as well. Like, take a bad scene, take an example of bad writing, and examine, not necessarily write a whole story like what I did, but just take the bits about it and start to think, well, what were they trying to get at with this scene? What were they trying to say? And then try to rewrite it so that you can communicate the themes and the ideas that the original author was trying to explore, but maybe didn't do it so well. And I think that's the important thing. So I hope this bit of writing advice. So to go through it, my first bit of advice was to read as much as you can. Try to fit reading into your routine when you're making breakfast, when you're making lunch, when you've got a bit of you time and you're sort of trying to unwind, and you, instead of going to something like listening to music or watching YouTube videos, find time to actually read a book and to actually get a flavour for writing. Read poetry because it helps you to understand metaphors, and it helps you understand the structure of a sentence, the rhythm and the flow of a sentence, and it helps you to understand things like repetition, rhythm and rhyme, which is always very crucial when writing prose. Use repetition well, but don't use it too often. Try to use it as sparingly as possible, because repetition, like in poetry, should always be used to draw emphasis or you're building towards something. Think of that poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, where he says, "The women come and go, talking of Michelangelo," and then look at that and see how it's repeated. You look at how he does repetition in that poem. I could do an entire video dedicated to poetry, but that's basically just, I'm setting it up here, I'm seeding it here. But I think this is a very important thing. But then also listen to music, listen to your favourite song, and listen to a song that makes you drift away, and makes you imagine, and makes you dream. And I also want to draw this back to Angel Dust, because when I first came up with the idea for Angel Dust, there was actually two sources. One of which was a toy that I used to have when I was a child, which it looks like a transformer, but it has wings, like a wingspan thing, and it has white wings, and it has sort of like this angel-like look, this very stereotypically biblical-like look, but it has sort of like a square chest. like a transformer or sort of like a Lego transformer thing. It's a very bizarre design that I'm starting to remember little flashes of in my memory. But I remember I looked at that and I said, I want to have a superhero that looks exactly like this. This looks cool. But then I remember listening to the song Iris, and I remember thinking to myself, the song Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. And I was on a very long, coach journey while I was in Spain. I was listening to this song, and it just ignited in my imagination all these images, the images of angel wings, the images of all these different things. And I immediately, very slowly, started to create the story of Angel Dust. And I wrote that first chapter, and then afterwards I either got distracted by other things because I wrote it back when I was in college, and I just put it in the drawer somewhere for a few years. And it was only when I was going through stuff to share for Reader's Corner for my YouTube channel that I actually thought, oh, this is actually really good. And then I rewrote it because it wasn't perfect. So I took it and I rewrote it, and I basically, just showcased the first chapter. And then I wrote the second chapter. I wrote about Zagreus, and then I wrote the third chapter about Simon and his mum. And then it just followed from there. And that's how it happened. So yeah, I hope this video was very informative to you guys. I hope you're all having a very good day. And let me know what you think of this video. Let me know what you think of this advice. If you're an aspiring writer, let me know what your writing advice would be to various fellow writers, and let me know what you think of this advice. I hope you're all doing very well. This has been Joshua WHIMS Industry Musing. If you like this video, or WHIMS, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please think about doing that if you want to be up to date with more videos. And if you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. I hope you're all having a very good day. This has been Josh with WHIMS. I hope you're all having a very good day. Take care. Bye bye for now.